Hello, everyone, and welcome to Off the Cuff, where the headlines come to life. We have Khurum Sheikh in the house today. He is a retired lieutenant, Ann Arbor police officer turned comedian. So please welcome Khurum Sheikh to Off the Cuff. Welcome.
Thank you.
And
welcome.
Thank you for being here.
Oh, thrilled to be here.
Amazing story, amazing history. Like I said, former Ann Arbor police officer turned comedian. So that in itself is an amazing story. But you actually came to the States when you were 7 years old, right? So did you come from Hawaii or Puerto Rico? Where did you
Actually from Pakistan.
There you go, from Pakistan.
Yes.
And you were saying earlier that a lot of people mistake you for maybe Puerto Rican or Mexican or
yes.
Hawaiian.
This was back when Pakistan was not as much in the
right,
news
right.
as it is now. And when I joined the Ann Arbor Police Department, it was not very diverse back then. It was over 30 years ago. So it was almost all white police department, had a handful of black officers, and then me. So one of my comedy routines is about how the sergeant could instantly know when a citizen was talking about me, because they would always say, "Oh yeah, it was that Puerto Rican guy."
Puerto Rican guy, yeah, absolutely. But you have quite a history. You came here at 7 years old, and your long life's dream was to become a police officer. So where did that inspiration come from? Was it something that was back home when you were younger, or were you inspired here?
Definitely inspired here. In fact, in the Pakistani culture, being a police officer is not prestigious at all. And
Really?
It's not really seen as a profession. And
but it would still be a sort of a title of authority. No?
Not for a low-ranking police officer.
Okay.
And so it just wasn't a prestigious job when I came to America. But I was one of those kids, you'd hear the siren, and you're wondering, oh, I wonder what they're up to. And I never lost that. And I knew I wanted to do comedy or things like that, but still have the practical Asian side where I need a job, money, health care. And police work was the only thing that interested me. Most of my family are medical doctors, and so they were shocked that I'd want to be a police officer. But 25 years later, I have a full pension, my health care, and they're like, we should have done that. So it's worked out well for me.
Well, tell us your experience being a lieutenant and being, culturally diverse, and following the course of police officer. You didn't start as a lieutenant, so
no.
you started as a police officer and sort of worked your way through. So how was that experience being Pakistani and culturally diverse? I mean, how were you accepted from the the entire community and your fellow police officers?
Yeah.
Or was it an issue?
There were times when it was difficult. Again, a lot of people didn't know much about Pakistan. When I grew up, the stereotype was, if you remember, like starving children in India,
yes,
and things like
absolutely.
that. So even growing up in America as a little kid, they'd be like, oh, I saw you, the flies, saw your relatives. So that was sort of the stereotype
It's all in
dealt
the perception.
with. Yes.
Absolutely.
And then as a police officer, probably one of the funnest things I did and felt like it was unique to me is when I worked undercover, because people just didn't associate being a police officer with a Pakistani person. And I had a beard, even longer hair than now, and I would play on all the stereotypes. So they thought I owned party stores and dealt in shady things. And so it was fun for me to play the stereotypes and then surprise them by revealing I'm a police officer and making an arrest. I can remember one particular time we'd have a jury and they have to look at the police as well as the defendant, and they would ask, if you know any of the people here, then you may not be eligible to be on the jury. And they said, first we'd like the defendant to stand up. And all of the people in the jury pool looked at me. And then a middle-aged white guy stood up as a defendant. They're all like,
wait a minute.
What? That guy's a police officer? So that was fun for me.
Oh, that's definitely the stereotype, you know, buster, absolutely. So what other scenarios in terms of your cultural diversity being an asset to you on the police on the police force? I mean, what give us an example
Well,
or a crazy run you were on that just sort of turned, you know, about your ethnicity or your culture.
yeah, a couple things stick out. One is we actually had a murder in Ann Arbor, which generally is fairly
Yeah,
safe.
very rare. Yeah.
But it was a Indian man that was murdered, and had no clues at first, and they called me in simply to help. I can speak Urdu, which is the main language in Pakistan. It's similar to Hindi in India, but just came to talk to the family and try to reassure them that we're following through and things like that. And so I met with everybody, including the family of the person who had been murdered. That night, I was working midnight shift, and they said, "Oh, there's a bunch of Indian people here to see you." And I think the detective who called me in didn't necessarily realize what they were about to say, because they came in and they said, "Oh, we've been talking in the community, and this gentleman actually witnessed the murder. He was there, and it was an Indian person who had come to them. And his story was that he was in the house when the murder occurred, and or saw the deceased, tried to do CPR, try to help him, and then realized it might look like he did the murder. So he quickly took off, washed his hands. He was worried fingerprints and things would be in the house, but that he had nothing to do with the murder." And of course, as he's telling me this, I'm like, does not appear to be truthful. And you could see he was very panicked about his fingerprints being at the scene, and was explaining why they could be there because we had detectives fingerprinted. And so I just let him talk and told him, you know, I believed him, but other people might be suspicious, and would he take a polygraph test? And that night he took one and eventually confessed that he had done the murder. And so that was something, it was unique, that brought me in because of my Indian heritage, and was able to help with that. I don't know if it was necessarily anything I said, but the family felt comfortable, and that was one. The other sort of interesting thing for me is I realized throughout my life America was always black and white. And me, I was in the gray areas, a lot of people are, and even some of the training that as a police officer I went to was all black and white, and I knew there was a growing Hispanic population, Middle Eastern, Arab, Indian, and so I started teaching diversity, cultural diversity to police officers. And I remember one of the first things I did, because I was no expert on it, but I knew as a police officer I'd have some credibility with police officers, and then being from Pakistan, have some credibility, but I had to research it. And one of the things I would start my training with is ask people, what is an Arab? How do you define somebody who's an Arab? Because we see it all the time in the news. And I would say less than 1 out of 10 times people could say what exactly, they'd say Middle East, but then Libya, Egypt, or in Africa. Then they would say different things, but very few people got it, that it was a linguistic label. That it's actually, if you come from a country that speaks Arabic, that was the dominant language. That was something I learned. And the one thing with the training isn't so much to teach them that, but that we have all these labels, we really don't even know what they mean.
Absolutely.
For me, last name is Sheikh, people often think I'm Arab. However, we're actually considered Asian from Pakistan, India, and people are always surprised that it's Asian, and I explain partly that when those labels came, they just like said, oh, this whole area, Asia, and it covers almost 3 billion people. So obviously a label that covers that many people is not very precise. But so those are the things I would get into in the training.
A lot of individuals think that Iranians are Arabs as well, and so, you know, I do something similar, and so that discussion is very very prevalent and very interesting.
Yeah.
And again, it's on the perception.
Yeah, and also, as I said, for me, I had to learn these things. As you know, Iranians speak Farsi, so they're not Arab because of the linguistic label, but we throw those labels around without really knowing.
You know, I know in the Arab country you have so many different dialects. I mean, if you're from Egypt, you have a certain dialect, from Yemen, a certain dialect, from Iraq, a certain dialect, and not necessarily everyone can sort of understand one another once they're together. Now, in Pakistan, is it the same kind of thing where there's different dialects and different, you know, it's sort of the same language, but a total different version where two people from two different areas would not be able to communicate very well?
Yes, Urdu is the main language, but there are
Right.
different dialects. And I came here at age 7. Although we spoke it at home, I would say I have like a 12-year-old's vocabulary. And sometimes I'll say something, they're like, oh, you speak Punjabi, which is a variation. And I didn't
Okay.
know I spoke Punjabi. It was just phrases
It was
that I
just
grew
the way
up
you
with.
pronounced it.
Yes. So, but there are definitely very diverse dialects within Pakistan.
You touched a little bit about your family in regards to wanting to be a police officer, but what were the repercussions on that, or were there any? Because I know, you know, that we tend to say, you know, the Pakistani community, again, you know, stereotyping a
Yes.
bit, but you know you have to be a doctor, you have to be a lawyer, you know something that's a little bit more, you know, desk oriented or what have you. So being a cop is totally outside the I want to say stereotype or perception.
Yes.
So how was that like for you? I mean, what were your family, you know, ideals of what you were going to be doing, and even the danger aspect?
Yes, as I said, they were very surprised. One of the things when I researched diversity and cultural diversity, I learned how immigrants came into the U.S. recently. It was in 1965, they had the Civil Rights Law that changed, and up until then, the country of origin was a factor. But it was changed after that, and one of the factors that let you come to America was if you had an economic skill that the economy needed.
Right.
So, because I didn't even know how did we end up in America, but that was it. That it was mostly medical doctors, and the economy needed
Pharmacists,
that. Exactly.
sure.
So that's how our family
They
was
were
able to
granted
come.
special entrance.
Exactly. And so to say I wanted to be a police officer, which again, Pakistan is low paying, and like a lot of third world countries, there's a lot of corruption, partly because the
Sure, so
police
the
are paid
perception
so
of
little.
your family would have been a little bit different.
And then the dangers is
Yeah.
something that they were worried about. As I knew before, because I like Joseph Wambach novels, which are about police work. But police work is not as physically dangerous as people think. It is more psychologically dangerous. They say more police officers commit suicide than are killed in line of duty. But a lot of people don't realize that. The way I explain it is if somebody is in a farming accident and dies, it's a one-paragraph story. If a police officer is killed in line of duty, it's headlines. So much like airline accidents, they get so much media attention that we have a skewed idea of how dangerous it is to fly or how dangerous it is to be a police officer. So I would explain that to my family, and I remember at one point my brother, and trying to soothe my mom and the rest of the family, had said, you know, Khurum's not one to take risks, unnecessarily this and that, but if anything ever happened to him, you know he was doing something he loved, something he wanted to do. And over time, when they became more comfortable, and then when I'd meet with relatives, and all they could talk about is the prescription they wrote, where I could talk about working undercover narcotics and things like that. So
I bet
actually,
you your stories were a lot more exciting.
right, exactly. So that's what I'm saying. And then police work is one of the few jobs left where you can get a decent pension after 25 years. So it has turned out very well for me. But at first, yes, it was difficult to explain.
Sure.
And even for me, I didn't know what to expect in police work. But I knew nothing else really seemed to excite me other than stand-up comedy.
So did your comedy help you through those years of being a police officer? Because it's pretty stringent. It's pretty, you know, it's pretty serious stuff when you're dealing with those things. So was that part of you something that sort of helped you through that process?
Yes, I think comedy, more than just being funny, that is my way of dealing with things. However,
Great way to cope with things.
Exactly, but a lot of people would be surprised to know what great sense of humor police officers generally have. It's just something where you,
Really?
as the public,
I
it really is
think
true. We might mostly be making fun of citizens.
Amazing people, but
Yeah.
they're serious at times. You
Yeah,
just never know
yeah.
when you.
But privately or within police officers, there's a lot of humor, sometimes a lot of dark humor, and
Absolutely,
and that's one of the ways all human beings cope. But police in general have a pretty good sense of humor, and do see a lot of things where you have to have a somewhat skewed sense of humor for it. But the citizens usually don't see that, or as we were having all these videotapes of police officers, usually are not videotaping when the officers are having a good day and showing that. So it's not unusual. In fact, I know several police officers now that do stand-up comedy.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
But none from Pakistan that I know of.
You are definitely unique. So you decided to go into comedy, and that was something that you loved earlier too. You have a degree in psychology as
Yes,
well.
I do. Yeah.
So that must have been very instrumental for your career path per se, and doing comedy and understanding psychology is extremely important, because you have to know what the boundaries are, know where you can go in order to get a laugh. And I really believe that you cannot you have to be able to laugh at yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be able to laugh at yourself, and I think that's the biggest barrier breaker, between cultures and between different ethnicities. So, how were you received as a police officer in the comedy in the comedy district or in the comedy scene? How were you received? Was it a positive one? Did you struggle? Was it a challenge? I'm sure that you had a lot of material through the years.
Yeah, it's always a challenge. It's always interesting. What I do now usually is I don't mention I'm a police officer in the beginning. Try to have the audience warm up to
I was
me.
going to say, you do that, you probably have everyone shuffling or trying to get out of the room, saying, wait a minute.
It depends on the crowd. But some are like, oh my gosh, I've got marijuana in my pocket, and so they're like focused on that rather than the comedy part.
Sure,
so,
it could be a distraction.
Yeah, so usually I try to warm them up, but then at some point I mentioned, and usually it gets applause when I say, regardless of what city, but I'm like the only Pakistani police officer doing stand-up comedy in Dearborn Heights, and I say, who looks like Johnny Mathis, and
That's true.
people of a certain age, usually I say the young people have to Google him, but I've been told I look like Johnny Mathis, and usually when I
You actually
put that,
do.
yeah,
You-
yeah.
yes.
But I remember once I actually took a class.
You could probably even pull that off as a Johnny Mathis look-alike comedian.
Yeah, people will ask if I can sing. I'm like, if I could sing, would I be just on traveling at the lower end of the circuit? But I was going to mention, I had taken actually a comedy class with a producer out of New York City, and he was saying that he listened to my shtick, so to speak, and he had said, well, there's lots of Pakistani police officers in New York. I don't know if that's necessarily that big a deal. And I'm thinking, that may be true in New York, but the towns I do, they've never even actually seen in person a Pakistani person. So you have to know the crowd and what's unique in a certain setting. But what I hope to do, and most comedians do, is evolve out of the stereotypes. Usually if I'm doing a show, all white crowd or all certain demographic, I do stick out and it's something to discuss, but then I want to do other comedy and get away from just all about the ethnic parts.
Is that most of your comedy, though? Do you focus on the Asian community, the Pakistani community, the stereotypes, the issues that we all, as a culturally diverse nation, love to laugh about? I mean, do you stick to that mostly, or are you more mainstream as well?
I would say about half and half now.
Okay.
But also I do jokes that I think only I could do, just from my perspective. For example, one I talk about, which is true, people learn I'm from Pakistan, at least off duty. Sometimes, especially in the past, they would dislike me because bin Laden was hiding there. On the other hand, they learn I'm a police officer, and people tend to like firefighters and police, certain groups anyway.
Absolutely.
So I talk about how people will hate me for being Pakistani, love me for being a police officer, but then I get the complete opposite reaction at my Al-Qaeda meeting.
Oh, Lord.
And then I'm saying, I'm kidding. I do not go to Al-Qaeda meetings. We chat online. So that's one of the jokes that is unique, and people will actually sometimes laugh and applaud, and I'm like, wow, you don't get Al-Qaeda meetings getting applause too often.
No, you don't.
And so that's one of the jokes that I surprise people with.
Well, you know what? I think with things that are happening right now, it's good to be able to break the ice on something like that, and just sometimes it's just the most ridiculous things that are that give you the most the most laughs and that are most comical. You are, and I'm really happy and honored that you're going to be joining us too for the Images and Perceptions Diversity Conference coming in April. And we usually have comedians that come in, and what I love about that portion is that we talk about the different cultures, and then the comedian comes in and equal opportunity employer just bashes everybody and talks about the stereotypes regarding everyone. And I find that kind of comedy just breaks the barriers and brings people together. And even though the comedy is about a certain ethnicity or culture, people can relate because we all sort of have the same kind of idiosyncrasies and the same kind of issues. So do you find that you appeal to the broader audience as well with your comedy?
I do, and I find people do like that police officers have a sense of humor, and then I can do jokes about terrorism and things from a different perspective. So I find people do like that. And the one thing I feel is going on in our nation now, where we're starting to get so politically correct that everybody, to me, and I think for most minorities, if somebody's got biases, we can deal with it. The tough part is the people who act like they don't have biases, who will appear so politically correct, but then from different things that they're not. And so I think that's what's going on, at least to some degree now. In fact, just before coming here, I saw they had a hidden video of a fraternity that was doing a very racist song.
Yes.
And so, but it's one of those things, unless somebody has a hidden camera, we don't see how much bias there is. But at a comedy club, you can make fun of it, you can point out the stereotypes, and not be so politically correct. And I think that is important. And I know I do several politically incorrect jokes, but I'll ask people, I think we're too politically correct, don't you think? And people will applaud. And that's not to say we need to bash people, whatever, but we need to be more honest, I think. And comedy allows you to do that. In fact, one of the reasons I like comedy was you are able to say true things, but make people laugh about it, and then you can actually get away with more than if you were very serious with it.
And it makes them think. I really think it makes them think more than something that's straight up or something that's serious.
Absolutely.
And it makes you laugh, and it opens up conversation.
Exactly.
I think, with other people.
Exactly.
So do you use your comedy mainly as a training tool for cultural diversity, or is it just something that you sort of gone into as a career, or is it something that you really focused on in terms of the cultural diversity aspect of it?
Well, for the comedy, at least when I was doing the training, I stayed away from the comedy part, other than just naturally if there are humorous things within the training, just because it can be a very sensitive humor. In a nightclub or a bar, whatever, is one setting, but in the classroom, it has to be done very delicately, and just because it is a different setting, and people are not expecting certain stereotype jokes and stuff. So I didn't do that in the training per se, but one of my ambitions with comedy in general is to break down the stereotypes, to make people think about things, and as you mentioned earlier, one of the best things you do is make fun of yourself.
Yes.
So being Pakistani, I can make fun of myself, of the stereotypes, of the things that are unique to that culture. But it's just like if you have a black comedian, they can say certain things that a white comedian cannot. If you have a very heavy comedian, they can make jokes about being heavy that somebody who's slim and in shape probably shouldn't, and it doesn't come across the same. Just Same with woman comedians. They can say certain things. So each of us have a unique niche. But the biggest thing is make fun of yourself and put the stereotypes out there. But as I say, eventually want to get away from the stereotypes. One of the ways I close my act in general, and it's very sincere, is I came to America because Pakistan was in a war. It was East Pakistan against West Pakistan. East Pakistan, as you probably know, became Bangladesh. But I can literally remember being in a little trench as bombs fell. And as I tell people at the comedy club, there is a country in the world that lets you emigrate and leave a war-torn area, and that's the United States of America. And so I'm thrilled that I was allowed to come here, and I'm always very grateful of this nation for that. And yet, we have issues. But to discuss them, be open about it is what will make us better.
Absolutely, and you really hit the nail on the head, because we do have issues, but we can discuss them and we can talk about them openly. Where there are many countries that you can't have an opinion, and you can't have freedom of speech. You can't have an issue and openly discuss it and give your opinion. So we definitely are fortunate to live in a country who's that welcoming, and have things in place for civil rights and human rights and the dignity of human beings, where in other countries it is missing, unfortunately. And hopefully those things will generate. I do want to ask you, who was your inspiration? I mean, I see a lot of comedians. I absolutely love Jon Stewart. Bill Maher as well. He's been a little bit controversial lately, but I love his style because it is politically incorrect, and that's what it's all about. Colbert Report is something that I've sort of learned to love. So who was your actual inspiration?
Well, first one was Richard Pryor.
Oh.
And I was a Richard Pryor fan from the few little movies I'd seen and in his talk shows, and then I saw the concert he did in 1979. I was like 18 years old and loved it. Loved it because it was very funny, but it was also about things. And I remember even then thinking, that's what I want to do. But being from Pakistani family, like I work with a lot of comedians who live in their basement with their parents and they're like in their mid-30s. And I was thinking, there's no way I could have done that with my mom. She would have supported me, but every single day I would have to hear about how so-and-so's doing this, and you're living in the basement. So I knew I wanted to get some sort of job outside of that.
Got that, absolutely.
Yes, but Richard Pryor was
your inspiration.
The person, especially because I did want to do, it's a weird kind of thing, but I want to do serious comedy. You
have something up, and we're running out of time, but I do want to get this in. You have something upcoming. You have something coming up with Richard Pryor's son.
Yes, the most surreal experience I've had in comedy, in that Richard Pryor was my icon, as it is for a lot of comedians. That's not an unusual name to mention. But I got a call to be in a movie and really didn't know much about it, but I said, sure, I'll do it. And it was with Mason Pryor, who, as soon as I saw him, I'm like, he looks like Richard Pryor's son. And then I looked at the movie. Is called Next Generation.
Okay. It's a comedy, I'm assuming?
It's a comedy. And I was in a scene and spent 8 hours with Mason Pryor, who not only looks but sounds like his father. I felt like I was making a movie with Richard Pryor. It was a very surreal thing, and he's very funny and he's very nice, and I did all I could to not even mention his father. I remember later we did a show and the comedian came up and had all his friends meet him, and he said, hey, this is Richard Pryor's son. I never even mentioned Mason's name, and so I did all I could to avoid being that person.
Well, that was kind.
But
I'm sure you appreciated
that.
But
it was a great experience, and the movie, I believe it's being edited and post-production, so hopefully it'll be out in about a year.
That was going to be my question. It'll be out in about a year, and it was called?
It's called Next Generation.
Next Generation. Great. Thank you for being with us on
my
Off
pleasure.
the Cuff.
Thank
it was
you.
a pleasure to have you. What a wonderful story. lieutenant turned comedian, who will also be appearing at the Images and Perceptions Diversity Conference, April 23rd. So come out and see him there, and also check him out at the different comedy clubs and Next Generation, the movie, next year. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us.